It started quietly, as so many things in history often do. A cough in the middle of the night. A pale child who once ran through the village square now lay still beneath a blanket of wool. No thunder in the sky, no fire on the horizon, just the silence of something unseen moving slowly across the land. Most people didn't know what it was at first. They didn't have words like infection or bacteria or plague. All they knew was that something was changing and people were beginning to vanish. In the quiet corners of medieval Europe, daily life moved at a slow, predictable pace. Farmers rose with the sun, worked their fields, and knelt at church. Townsfolk gathered near wells to exchange bread and rumors. Children laughed, animals bleated, bells rang out from stone towers. And yet, behind this familiar rhythm, there was always something fragile. The people of the Middle Ages lived close to the edge, close to hunger, close to pain, and all too often, close to death. And when disease came, it came like a shadow stretching long across the countryside. Our story isn't one of loud battles or heroic knights. It's a quieter tale, a darker one, perhaps, one that creeps under the skin and lingers in the air. It's about the invisible enemies that swept through villages and cities, humbling kings and peasants alike. This is the story of the deadliest diseases in medieval history, of forgotten fevers, swollen towns, and prayers whispered in candlelight. Long before modern hospitals, antibiotics, or clean water, people faced illnesses with whatever they had: herbs, hope, and the knowledge passed down by word of mouth. There were no doctors in white coats. Instead, there were wise women, monks with dusty scrolls, and wandering healers offering potions of garlic and vinegar. They did what they could, but often it wasn't enough. In a cold English village near the coast, a woman named Margaret watched helplessly as her youngest son grew still beneath the sheets. She had boiled herbs, burned incense, and prayed with cracked lips, but nothing worked. The sickness had come fast, taking his appetite, then his breath. Her neighbors said it was bad air, or perhaps a curse. But Margaret knew it was something deeper, something that was slowly creeping from house to house. At the same time, in the crowded alleys of Paris, a baker's apprentice named Thomas was coughing into his sleeve. His boss told him to stop whining, to get back to work, but Thomas couldn't shake the chills. His fingertips were turning dark, and he hadn't eaten in days. He stumbled home that night, barely able to walk. By morning, his bed was empty, and his door was shut for good. Not far across the sea, in a stony monastery tucked between the hills of Spain, a monk sat by candlelight, recording what he saw. "Many of our brothers," he wrote, "have fallen ill with black swellings. They do not rise from their cots. Their eyes roll back, and their skin grows dark as night. We do not know what this is. We pray. We wait." His handwriting trembled, and that page would later be found with a brown stain along the edge. This was the pattern, silent, relentless, and utterly unpredictable. The diseases of medieval history didn't just kill the body. They broke trust. They made people fear each other. Doors stayed closed. Bread was left at doorsteps. Whole families disappeared without a sound. And through it all, people kept wondering the same thing. Why? The truth is, no one fully understood what was happening. Germs were not yet discovered. Doctors still believed in imbalances of humors in the body, blood, bile, and phlegm. So they bled patients or made them vomit, thinking they could balance the sickness away. Some towns hired people to walk the streets with smoke pots, hoping to clean the air. Others blamed strangers, animals, or the stars above. Everyone was afraid. Everyone had a different story. In Germany, a small boy named Elias hid beneath his mother's cloak as men dragged a cart through the town, collecting bodies. The smell clung to everything. People stuffed herbs into their noses, wrapped scars around their mouths, but it didn't help. Elias asked why no one could stop it. His mother didn't answer. She didn't know. As nights grew longer and colder, fear turned to silence. Churches once filled with hymns now echoed with quiet sobbing. Letters stopped arriving. Markets closed. Fields grew wild. Even the crows grew quiet. But not everyone died. Some survived, scarred yes, but alive. They had stories to tell, stories that made their way across time, whispered by firelight or carved into stone. We still have those stories now, though they're faded and fragile. And from them, we can trace the outlines of the diseases that haunted that age. From the infamous Black Death that wiped out millions across Europe, to smaller outbreaks of sweating sickness and ergotism, medieval life was constantly shadowed by disease. Rats and fleas, dirty water, spoiled grain, all of it played a role. But the real terror lay in the fact that people didn't know what was killing them. That unknowing, that helplessness, is what gave these diseases their power. In Italy, a merchant once wrote in his journal, "The city is quiet. The priests have stopped burying the dead. My neighbor Giovanni burned his house down because he believed it was cursed. I do not leave my bed. I wait. If God sees fit, I will be taken. If not, I will write again tomorrow." There was no entry after that. As you drift deeper into this story, imagine walking through a village where every window is shuttered, where the air is heavy, and footsteps echo strangely, where people speak in whispers and every cough turns heads. This is not just a history of sickness. It's a story of survival, of mystery, and of the ways humans held on to each other when everything else seemed to fall apart. And yet, not all questions were answered. Not all towns recovered. Some vanished entirely, overgrown with weeds, their names lost to time. What truly caused the darkest outbreaks? What lessons did they leave behind? And what did it feel like to stand at the edge of the unknown, waiting for something you couldn't see? That's where we'll go next. But first, let the candle burn low. Let the bells in the distance fade. Let us begin slowly, patiently, step by step, through the quiet fog of medieval history, where the deadliest diseases waited in silence, and where not everyone who walked and made it out again. The night before it began in the village of Elmsbrook was oddly warm. Chickens clucked restlessly in their coops, and the village dogs barked at shadows no one could see. A traveling friar, newly arrived from the south, had spent the evening in the alehouse sharing stories about strange happenings in the city. He mentioned illness, eyes clouding over, and priests refusing to enter homes. But few listened. Most were too busy enjoying their warm drink, glad for the break in the chill. By morning, the friar was gone, and the baker's daughter, Alice, had not opened the shutters. People knocked. No one answered. A few curious neighbors went in. What they found was enough to make even the strongest among them step back into the street in silence. No one would speak of it openly, but word spread fast. People stopped going out at night. They tied bundles of rosemary and sage above their doors, whispered prayers they hadn't said in years, and looked to the skies for signs. Far away in Florence, something similar had happened weeks earlier. Only, it was faster there, denser, louder. The city's narrow alleys were thick with people, noise, and the smells of market life. And then the noise began to fade. Bread stalls went unstaffed. The scent of cooked meat vanished. People began to see strange signs on their neighbors' faces. Black marks, trembling hands, swollen lumps on necks and groins. The word pestilence passed from mouth to mouth, each time sounding more like a curse. Giovanni, a young apprentice working under a goldsmith, kept a journal of what he saw. His handwriting was neat at first, full of curiosity and quiet alarm. But with each passing day, his words grew shaky, panicked, urgent. He wrote of friends gone overnight, of entire households locked from the outside, of smoke rising from streets where infected belongings were burned. "The bells ring now every hour," he wrote, "not for mass, but for mourning." One of the strangest things about the diseases of medieval Europe was how differently they appeared. Some came slowly, fevers building over days, coughs that lingered and deepened. Others were sudden and ruthless, striking people down in a matter of hours. One such illness, the dreaded sweating sickness, was feared for just that reason. A person might be perfectly fine in the morning, sweating and gasping by noon, and gone by nightfall. No warning, no mercy. Just a wave of heat, a sense of doom, and then silence. In England, a clerk named Roger described the sweating sickness in his own words. "It is as if the body turns against itself," he wrote. "One moment, you are steady and calm. The next, your heart beats wild, and you know it is too late. I have seen 3 men fall in one day, their skin slick and pale. The Lord must be testing us. But not everyone believed it was the Lord's doing. In some regions, people blamed outsiders, travelers, or even cats. There were towns that rounded up animals believed to carry evil spirits, convinced they were behind the plague. In doing so, they may have only made things worse. Rats, now free to roam without predators, thrived in filthy corners, helping spread fleas that carried the deadly bacteria. People couldn't know. They were fighting something blindfolded. Meanwhile, in the monasteries, where knowledge was copied and preserved by candlelight, monks tried to make sense of it all. Some turned to the stars, recording unusual alignments of planets and moons. Others blamed foul smells, or miasmas, believing that sickness came from poisonous air rising out of swamps and rotting matter. To cleanse the air, they lit fires in the streets, filled rooms with fragrant herbs, and carried sweet-smelling pouches around their necks. But nothing stopped the dying. In one such monastery in France, Brother Martin took it upon himself to record the names of all those who had passed in his region. He believed that memory was a kind of resistance, a way to hold on to dignity in the face of so much vanishing. His list grew longer each day. Eventually, he ran out of parchment. By the end of his last entry, he simply wrote, "I have no more ink. May God remember them better than I can." And still the sicknesses came. In remote villages tucked between forests and hills, some people tried to escape by fleeing into the wilderness. They took only what they could carry: bread, wool blankets, a few coins, thinking that the disease lived only in crowded places. For some it worked. For others, it only delayed the inevitable. Even the woods, water could carry illness. A single sick companion could infect a whole traveling group. And so they moved further into the silence, deeper into isolation, waiting for the sickness to pass. Back in the cities, those left behind developed new habits. If someone died, their belongings were often burned. Doors were marked with chalk or soot. Some households placed a candle in the window to warn others. Others left signs on the road, scrawled in trembling hands, "Stay away." And yet, despite all the precautions, nothing felt safe. Fear had taken root in the mind as much as in the body. A merchant named Oswin, who had once traveled between towns selling spices and cloth, found himself stranded in an outside Bruges. "No one will buy," he wrote in a letter to his sister. "No one dares to shake hands. I have sat in this room for 12 days. The innkeeper has not spoken to me since the 3rd. I believe I may be the only one left." His letter, now stained and torn, was found many years later beneath a cracked floorboard, never sent. One of the quiet tragedies of medieval diseases was how much they robbed people of connection. Weddings were canceled. Markets were emptied. Churches that once echoed with hymns now stood eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of a wooden pew or the soft rustle of wind through broken windows. Priests spoke sermons to empty benches. Funerals were hurried, often done at a distance. Gone were the comforting rituals of community. In their place, only uncertainty. Still, life continued. In hidden corners, mothers cradled children and hummed lullabies they barely remembered. Shepherds tended to their sheep in high meadows, watching the clouds for signs. Old men carved wood by candlelight, telling stories to no one. These quiet moments, often overlooked, became the heartbeat of survival. Small acts of care, fragments of routine, and in those moments, hope flickered like a single flame in a storm. But not every story ended in quiet survival. In a crumbling farmhouse outside Prague, a man named Jakub began to keep a list, not of the dead, but of symptoms. He believed if he could understand the pattern, he might find a way to predict the illness. His notes were methodical. Day 1, sweating. Day 2, trembling hands. Day 3, black spot on lower back. For a while, it gave him purpose. Then the pages stopped. We don't know what happened to Jakub, just as we don't know what happened to so many. Their stories are scattered across time like dust, and yet together, they form a picture, a soft, dark tapestry of fear, resilience, confusion, and mystery. Now, as you lie still and let your thoughts drift, imagine yourself walking slowly through a field that once held a village. The grass is high. The wind is soft. You hear a church bell in the distance, though there's no one to ring it. The sun is low, and shadows stretch long. You feel the echoes of the past beneath your feet, not in loud cries or distant screams, but in silence. A silence that once held everything. But the story doesn't end here. There's more to uncover, more to feel, more to remember. The darkest chapter is still ahead. Beneath the crumbling walls of an old manor house, a servant named Beatrice wrapped her hands in linen before entering the sick room. The family she worked for had grown silent over the past week. At first it was the older daughter, pale, coughing, too tired to rise. Then the younger brother. Now, the mother barely opened her eyes. Beatrice did what she could. She boiled wine with herbs, wiped brows, whispered psalms. But she had begun to forget what it was like to hear laughter in the halls. Each morning, she paused before turning the doorknob, uncertain what she would find inside. Just a few months earlier, the manor had been filled with celebration. A wedding had taken place under the apple trees, with guests dressed in embroidered cloaks, flutes playing, tables crowded with meats and breads. The air had been full of joy, and no one spoke of illness. But now the trees were bare, the windows shuttered, the servants gone, and Beatrice moved through the rooms like a ghost, caring for what remained. Far north, in the damp lowlands of the Netherlands, farmers began to leave their tools in the fields. There were no songs as they planted, no shouts from across the rows, just the sound of the wind and the quiet crunch of boots in the earth. In some towns, the bells stopped altogether, not because the priest had died, but because the bell ringer had. In places like these, even silence became too heavy to bear. Some villages took to ringing bells with ropes from inside their homes, never stepping outside. Others filled the churches with candles, though few dared to enter. People passed notes under doors. Bread was traded by leaving it on flat stones. Coins were dropped into buckets of vinegar before changing hands. Every movement had weight, and every breath seemed like a risk. It wasn't just the Black Death that haunted these centuries. Long before and long after its terrible peak, other illnesses came and went like cruel visitors. There's the leprosy that slowly disfigured the skin and sent sufferers into distant colonies beyond the city walls. There was the ergot poisoning brought on by moldy rye that made people twitch and see visions, sometimes believed to be the work of witches or demons. And there were waves of fever, intermittent, deadly, confusing, that swept through the countryside every few years without warning. In an abbey near the Rhine River, a novice named Helena began to feel the sting of fever one late autumn night. She had been copying a psalter, hunched over the parchment, when her fingers began to shake. She thought it was exhaustion at first, or perhaps hunger, but by the next evening she could barely sit upright. The nuns laid her in a quiet cell, surrounded by woolen cloths and lavender water. Some stayed by her side. Others wept quietly and prayed in the chapel. Helena survived, but when she returned to her writing weeks later, her hand never moved the same way again. The letters trembled. Still, she kept writing. In another part of the continent, by the old Roman roads leading to Lyon, travelers told stories of a village where no one answered the door. Horses refused to enter the main path, and crows circled high above, as if waiting. Some said the village had made a pact with dark forces. Others said they had simply all fallen ill and never recovered. No one went near enough to know the truth. Over time, the village faded from maps, its name forgotten. These quiet erasures were common. Disease didn't just take lives. It wiped out records. Family names ended. Trade routes vanished. Births were never registered. And in the absence of memory, fear grew stronger. People began to suspect their neighbors. Suspicion lived in glances, in whispers, in locked doors. Even among family, trust grew thin. And still, the sickness moved forward. But it wasn't always sorrow. In some corners of Europe, tiny flickers of resistance began to grow. Midwives began to notice patterns. Certain teas soothed coughs better than others. People who boiled their water seemed to avoid illness longer. Monks began tracking symptoms more carefully, writing in the margins of text to update treatments. They didn't yet understand germs, but they observed behavior. And through slow learning, tiny victories began to take shape. In a cold village near Krakow, an old man named Marek became known as the herb finder. He had no formal training, just years of watching plants grow and listening to how they affected people. When fever swept the town, he brought crushed leaves of wild mint and bark boiled with honey. He didn't claim to cure anything, but people swore they felt better, less afraid, less alone. In times of widespread illness, kindness becomes a kind of rebellion. A loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a clean blanket passed through a window, a song hummed from behind a closed door, just loud enough for someone to hear. These moments didn't stop the diseases, but they gave people something to hold on to. Elsewhere, art began to reflect the changes. Church murals showed skeletal figures dancing among the living, a reminder that death spared no one, rich or poor, young or old. These danse macabre paintings, though grim, helped people cope. They gave form to fear and taught a strange kind of acceptance. That death was part of life, and that perhaps, even in loss, there was still beauty. In Spain, a poet wrote of the plague, not as a punishment, but as a passage. "We are like ships at sea," he wrote, "and the sickness is the storm. But storms pass, and even broken ships can still reach shore." His verses, copied by hand, made their way to distant corners of Europe, carried in saddlebags, shared in whispered recitations by candlelight. Still, the toll was unimaginable. In some regions, entire generations disappeared. In others, children grew up without parents, cared for by aging grandparents or strangers. Streets that once bustled with life now felt hollow, and the memory of the worst days never truly faded. People carried it in their bones, in the way they looked at strangers, in the cautious way they greeted joy. As time passed, disease became a part of everyday thinking. Towns built pest houses on their outskirts, small buildings where the sick could be sent, far from the rest of the population. Ships arriving in harbor had to wait in isolation before unloading, an early form of quarantine. Some places required travelers to carry a plague certificate proving their town was free of illness. These were small attempts at order, at control, in a world where so much felt untouchable. And yet, the most terrifying part remained, the question: why did some people die and others live? Why did one family perish, while another, next door, went untouched? There were no easy answers. Not then. Not now. People told stories, made guesses, and prayed harder. But the mystery lingered. And as the story stretches into deeper hours of the night, the questions only grow heavier. What if the next illness comes in a new form? What if it hides for days, weeks, before revealing itself? What if, like the ones before, it finds its way not through noise or crowds, but through silence? Through the hand we hold, the food we share, the air we breathe? But those are questions for another time. For now, we remain here, in the quiet heart of the Middle Ages, where the fires still burn low and the scent of rosemary hangs in the air. The world is smaller now, softer, slower, and just beyond the window, the wind continues to whisper across the fields, carrying with it secrets from a time when every breath was precious and every heartbeat a victory. But the worst has yet to come. Will you walk with me further? Somewhere between the tall forests of the Baltic and the wide rivers of the East, a rider paused beside an empty village. The place was still, so still it felt untouched by time. Wooden carts were left mid-path, doors hung ajar, and birds fluttered in and out of broken shutters as if they owned the homes now. The rider, a trader named Edric, had passed many towns like this in recent weeks. But this one was different. There were no signs of violence, no bodies, no scorch marks, just silence and a lingering heaviness in the air. He didn't dismount, just sat for a while listening. Wind blew softly through the trees. The distant creak of a hanging sign. A child's doll, left on the step, stared blankly into the grass. Edric had once dreamed of mapping these roads, drawing neat lines between places of trade and learning. Now he wasn't sure if there would be any towns left to mark. Whatever had passed through here hadn't left a name, only absence. Back in the west, in a crumbling town near the river Loire, two brothers, Adrian and Luke, kept to themselves in their family stone house. Their father had passed the year before, taken by a sudden fever, and their mother had not spoken much since. Luke, the younger, still believed they'd be safe if they stayed indoors, if they boiled water and covered the cracks under the door with old rags. Adrian, more skeptical, had started walking into the village late at night, leaving food where it was needed, listening for any sign of normal life. But the town had changed. Windows once lit with warm yellow glow were dark now. Dogs roamed untethered, their howls echoing in the narrow streets. Adrian had seen a man in a dark cloak near the old church once, just standing there. But when he turned back to look, the figure was gone. It could have been a dream. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. Their mother sat by the fire most evenings, muttering softly to herself, her rosary worn smooth by her fingers. She didn't speak of the illness, but every so often she would stop and listen, as if she could hear something no one else could, a whisper, a step, a sigh. When Luke asked her what she heard, she only shook her head and whispered, "It's not gone yet." And it wasn't. In the villages and towns tucked between hills and rivers, strange patterns had begun to appear. Some places were spared entirely, while others just a mile away were reduced to ash and silence. The healers and monks who kept records had noticed it too. They gathered notes in margins and sidebooks. 10 households ill, 1 untouched. Child survived, parents lost. No signs of wounds, yet fever struck all. None of it made sense. In the colder north, a widow named Ingrid had turned her cottage into a place of rest for the few travelers brave enough to continue moving. She gave them warm broth, water, and a clean place to sleep. She didn't ask for coin, only stories. Each person she hosted told a different tale. One said the illness followed the fog. Another claimed it came only after dreams filled with voices. A third man said he saw strange birds circling above a village before it was taken. Ingrid listened to them all, though she shared none of her own stories. She had lost a daughter the winter before. The girl had complained of cold feet, then burning skin, then nothing. Ingrid had buried her with her favorite comb and hadn't spoken names since. But she kept the hearth warm and the door open. Perhaps because some part of her believed that warmth still mattered. Some records from the time mentioned dreams. Vivid ones. Entire towns where people began to speak of the same symbols. Black horses, cracked bells, rivers that ran uphill. These weren't the usual superstitions. People from different regions, far apart, began drawing similar shapes in the dirt. Circles with slashes. Eyes surrounded by flame. No one could explain it. The church warned against sharing such visions, calling them tricks of the devil. But the drawings kept appearing. Children painted them on walls. Shepherds carved them into fence posts. Monks found them in the margins of return books. And always a few days later, sickness followed. In a port town in Ireland, a healer named Royson tried to track the signs. She wasn't a scholar, but she had a keen sense for detail. She marked the sightings on her wall using charcoal. Each drawing, each dream, each person who spoke of the dark eye. Her wall soon filled with markings. But the more she wrote, the more frightened she became. The symbols were spreading faster than the sickness itself. She confided in a priest once. He told her to burn the wall, to pray, and stop listening to nonsense. That night, his home caught fire. No one could say why. Royson stopped speaking to priests after that. Even far across the seas, traders whispered of strange stories. In Constantinople, people said a sickness had come that made people forget who they were. A baker no longer knew his own name. A mother didn't recognize her child. They seemed healthy at first, and then simply faded. The body stayed. The self vanished. Others swore the disease traveled with silence. No birds, no wind, no sound at all. There were stories of bells that rang by themselves, of cloaks found in empty beds, still warm, of candles that refused to stay lit, no matter how many times they were struck. These were tales shared at firesides, but always with a nervous glance over the shoulder. No one agreed on the source. Some believed it was punishment. Others said it was nature's balance, correcting the greed of men. A few thought it came from the earth itself, from deep below, where forgotten things stirred. But most simply lived day to day, trying not to ask too many questions, trying to survive. And still, across ruined towns, behind locked doors under starless skies, the sickness crept onward. In a schoolhouse outside Prague, a teacher named Tomas began writing a journal, not for others, but for himself. His students had stopped coming weeks ago. The benches sat empty, covered in dust. But Tomas came every morning, lit a single candle, and wrote down what he remembered. Names, faces, dreams. He feared he would forget them if he didn't. One day, he wrote something strange. He said he had seen a figure on the hill outside town. A tall, thin man, wearing no cloak, standing perfectly still in the rain. Tomas watched him for over an hour. The figure never moved. The next day, Tomas was too tired to write. The journal stopped there. Whatever was moving through the land was more than just an illness. It was a silence, a shadow, a forgetting. And the more people tried to understand it, the more questions appeared. How could something kill so quickly in one place and pass over another without a trace? Why did some people dream of the same things without ever meeting? And what, if anything, waited on the other side of the sickness? But no one could say. Not yet. The roads grew colder, the nights longer, and though fires still warmed a few rooms and bread still baked in a few ovens, the feeling was growing. Something was coming, and it had not yet shown its true face. By the time snow fell over the village of Alm, most of the hearths had already gone cold. The streets were covered, not just in frost, but in stillness, the kind that made the trees seem taller, the sky more distant. People who once shouted greetings across muddy paths now only whispered, if they spoke at all. The sickness hadn't hit them hard, not yet, but they'd heard enough stories to know what could happen. Sometimes fear came first, even before the first cough. Elsbeth, a weaver who lived at the edge of the village, watched the snow settle on her windowsill. She hadn't left her cottage in 6 days. Her husband had gone into the woods and not returned. Perhaps he was avoiding the town, hoping to wait things out in the hunting lodge. Perhaps she didn't let her thoughts go further. She kept her hands moving, spinning thread, even though there was no one left to buy it. Outside, near the frozen well, someone had placed a bundle of dried flowers, a quiet offering. No name, no note, just a few sprigs of lavender tied in a strip of cloth. Elsbeth saw it from her window. She wondered who had left it. Maybe someone grieving. Maybe someone trying to keep beauty alive, even as the world fell quiet. Not far across the countryside, in a place once known for its yearly fairs and lively musicians, the town of Helmsley stood nearly empty. The market square was still, the fountain dry, and the bell tower had begun to lean slightly to one side. No one rang the bell anymore. It had rung too often in the past year, once for every death. And now, even a priest had stopped counting. One man remained, a carpenter named Ansel. He refused to leave, even when his neighbors packed their carts and moved toward the mountains. He said someone had to keep watch. Someone had to keep the stories. Every evening, he lit a lantern and placed it in the tower window in case a traveler came by. No one had, not in months. Still, Ansel climbed the stairs each night, breathing through a cloth soaked in vinegar, and lit the flame. Back in the hills, a young girl named Mari wandered alone along a deer path. She had survived the sickness, whatever it had been, but her village had not. She spoke little, only to herself, sometimes, or to the birds who followed her from tree to tree. She carried a small pouch filled with wild garlic, dried apple slices, and an old wooden comb. Her mother's. She didn't know where she was going, only that moving felt safer than staying. Occasionally, she would come across others, quiet travelers with hollow eyes, old women in cloaks of faded green, boys with makeshift spears. They rarely spoke, just nodded, shared what food they had, then moved on. Mari would lie beneath the trees at night, listening to the wind, and wonder if the world had always been like this, or if she had simply come into it too late. And far beyond these scattered lives, in the coastal city of Marseille, a letter was penned in careful Latin script. It was addressed to no one, meant only for the future. The author, a physician named Bernard, had stayed behind while most fled the city. He wanted to record what he saw. He believed it mattered. He described the way the disease changed its shape, how it looked like one thing in the winter and another in the spring, how some grew cold while others burned, how one man would die within hours and another lingered in half-conscious pain for weeks. It is not like the plagues I have read of, he wrote. It is a shadow that wears many faces, and none of them stay long. Bernard treated who he could, but mostly, he wrote. His small house smelled constantly of boiled vinegar and rosemary. The floors were littered with crumpled notes, many crossed out in frustration. In his final entry, he wrote only one line. I do not think we are meant to understand it. His house was later found locked from the inside. Far to the east, across the snowy plains, a traveler arrived in a monastery with nothing but frost on his cloak and a single torn page in his hand. The monks took him in, gave him soup, and let him rest near the kitchen fire. When he awoke, he could not remember his name, only that he had come from a place where the skies turned dark at noon and the rivers had begun to taste like ash. The monks called him Sylvan. Sylvan stayed at the monastery for weeks. He worked in the garden, fixed a broken roof, even helped copy scripture. But he never remembered more of his past. Some nights, he would walk the chapel in silence, pausing at the stained glass window with the image of St. Lazarus. He came back, Sylvan would whisper. But from where? One monk began to keep notes on Sylvan's dreams. They were vivid, strange, always the same symbols. An open door with no frame, a bell with no clapper, a tree that grew upside down. One night, Sylvan woke with a start and said only, "It's not the sickness we should fear. It's what follows after." The monks prayed harder after that, and so the world turned. In quiet places, in empty towns, in forest paths and candlelit rooms. The sickness changed people, even those it did not touch directly. It made them smaller, more careful. It made them notice things, sounds, patterns, stories that might have once been ignored. Life slowed, narrowed. A cough meant something now. A silence meant more. And all the while, the questions remained. What had really caused the worst outbreaks? Why did they seem to rise like waves, vanish, then rise again with new names and symptoms? Why did some people feel like they had dreamed the sickness before it came? And why did so many describe that same feeling? The sense that something was watching from just beyond the walls, waiting, listening? The answers were never clear, but the stories lived on. Somewhere, a shepherd still played his flute in the highlands, where the wind howled and the sheep wandered freely. Somewhere, a mother taught her child how to boil thyme and honey into a soothing tea. Somewhere, an old man traced the stars each night and whispered the names of the constellations, just in case someone forgot them. And somewhere, beyond all of this, the shadow waited. Not rushing, not chasing, just waiting, as if it knew that fear does not need speed, only patience. But the people of those years, weary though they were, still walked forward, still sang quietly, still dared to light fires at night. And in those quiet sparks, in those soft lullabies hummed to no one, a kind of strength remained, a strength that held on even when all else faded. But the shadow was not done yet, and what it left behind would change everything. By the time spring reached the mountain villages, the birds had returned, but the people had not. Fields lay untouched, fences leaned with age, and footpaths once worn smooth by travel were now covered in moss and scattered leaves. Snow melted from rooftops, but no chimney smoke followed. The season had arrived, but the rhythm of life was slower now, like a song half forgotten. In one village, high in the Tyrolean Alps, a boy named Otto spent his days gathering stones. Not for trade or for building, but for memory. Each stone marked a name, a face, a story he didn't want to forget. He placed them in a line behind the church, each one carefully carved with a symbol he had made up himself. He didn't know the old letters, but his shapes, circles, slashes, spirals, meant something to him. Each was a promise not to forget. Otto hadn't spoken much since the sickness took his father. His mother had recovered, though her voice never fully returned. They spoke in gestures now, in glances and simple signs. They didn't need words to understand one another. They just stayed close, kept the fire going, and watched the valley for signs of movement. Most days there was none. In a different valley, hundreds of miles away, a river wound through what had once been a thriving trade town. Now, the boats were gone. The riverbanks were quiet. The bridge that crossed it had collapsed during a storm, and no one had come to rebuild it. On the far side, an elderly woman named Bruna still lit a lantern every evening and set it by the window. She had done so every night since her son left to find medicine in the south. That had been nearly a year ago. She never stopped waiting. Bruna's neighbors were gone. Some had left early. Some had grown sick and never rose again. She stayed. She always had. The home had belonged to her grandmother, and before that, her great-grandfather. She believed houses remembered things. So she swept the floors, dusted the old beams, and kept the garden neat. Even when no one walked by, she trimmed the hedges. One morning, as dew clung to the grass and the river glimmered with pale sunlight, Bruna found a fresh footprint just beyond her gate. A single step, too small to be her own, too deep to have come from the wind. She stood there a long while, staring at it, her heart quiet and full. Whoever it was, they hadn't knocked, hadn't spoken, but they had passed by. That night, she placed 2 lanterns in the window. Far to the west, along the jagged coast of Brittany, a sailor named Henri kept watch from a cliffside tower. The sea was calm now, but he remembered the storms. He remembered the ships that had brought the sickness from other lands, docking with false papers, hiding their dead below deck. He remembered the fear in the harbor master's eyes when he'd realized what had happened too late. Now Henri stood watch, not for ships, but for silence. He said he could feel it coming again, not through noise or weather, but through the stillness itself. When the gulls vanish, he muttered to himself one morning, "We'll know it's time." He hadn't seen a gull in 2 days. Below the cliffs, the village fishermen tied knots into their nets, not for strength, but as charms. Their wives drew circles in chalk near the hearths, tucked dried sage into their sleeves, and walked the long way to the well just to avoid certain stones in the path. No one talked openly of the sickness anymore, but it was still there, in gestures, in superstition, in the spaces between words. Even the children knew it. They played differently now. No more running in crowds or shouting near the fields. They played in pairs, at most, or alone. Their games were quieter. They dug small holes and filled them with water, pretending they were building wells. They buried little sticks in lines and called them rememberings. One girl, quiet and thoughtful, would draw a face in the dirt each day, and then cover it gently with her hands, as if tucking it to sleep. In the deeper parts of the woods, where the trees grew thick and the sunlight barely reached the ground, travelers whispered of a place they called the Still. No maps marked it, and no one could describe it the same way twice. Some said it was a clearing. Others said it was a crumbling church or an old road swallowed by ivy. But all agreed on one thing. No sound ever reached it. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even footsteps grew quiet there, as if the earth itself had grown weary of noise. Those who found it never stayed long. Some said they left feeling calm. Others said they felt watched. One boy claimed he saw something move, tall, pale, distant. But when he turned to look, nothing was there. He left the woods that same night and never went back. And so the years turned. The sickness, in its many forms, came and went like the tides. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes a fever, sometimes a chill. Sometimes it left a mark. Sometimes it left only silence. But through it all, people endured, not always understanding, but always moving forward. One breath, one step, one quiet day after another. In the capital cities, where record keepers sat hunched over ink pots and stacks of parchment, there were arguments. Was it all the same disease? Or many? Should they blame the water? The stars? The air? Some scholars said it was punishment for greed. Others insisted it was natural. A few believe the earth itself had grown tired of carrying so many. But the truth was simpler and sadder. No one really knew. Not then. Not now. And perhaps that was the hardest part. But even in that not knowing, there was a kind of grace. Because people still lit candles, still shared stories, still found ways to care. A mother teaching her child how to dry herbs for winter. A stranger leaving bread on a doorstep. A priest carving names into a stone cross when ink ran out. These are not cures, but they were comforts. And comforts, in times of darkness, are no small thing. The wind continues to move gently through the grass. Somewhere, a well still gives clean water. Somewhere, a baby cries and is answered with a lullaby. Somewhere, even now, someone lights a lantern, just in case another traveler is out there, cold, tired, searching. But the shadows haven't fully lifted. There is still more to tell. The worst of it, the strange final wave, has not yet come. And when it does, everything will change again. The lantern burned lower now, flickering with each breath of wind that slipped through the cracks in the old wooden shutters. In the town of Vire, a once bustling market square stood deserted, its cobblestones stained by time and forgotten footsteps. Only one man remained behind the apothecary's bench, Master Jourdain, the healer, the last of his trade in that region. His fingers were stained dark from mixing roots and powders. His voice had grown hoarse from weeks of silence. And yet, every evening, he still lined up his jars and prepared his table, as if someone might knock on the door needing help. No one had, not since the twins. It had started with the girl, Leonie. She'd come in quietly, face pale, hands cold, but clear-eyed. She didn't speak, just looked at him and held up a small piece of folded cloth. Inside it, a single dark leaf. Belladonna. She had found it in the woods, thinking it was healing. Her brother had chewed one by accident. Master Jourdain had tried everything, boiling milk, bleeding the arm, pressing warm oil to his neck. But the boy was gone before sunrise. Leonie never came back. She had walked out into the mist and disappeared, leaving behind the leaf and silence. Now, Jourdain kept that same leaf in a glass bottle by the window. He looked at it each day. It reminded him how little he understood. For all his books and remedies, the sickness still outran him. It wasn't just the fever anymore. People had begun showing new symptoms: forgetfulness, sudden fear, strange dreams, and then nothing. No pain, no struggle, just stillness. As if life had quietly slipped out the back door and left only the shell behind. Not far from Vire, beyond the river's bend, a group of pilgrims traveled through a forgotten valley. They wore simple robes, carried nothing but satchels of bread and salt, and sang in low, slow tones. Their leader, a woman named Isabel, claimed they had seen visions, stars falling from the sky, animals walking in circles, and lakes that reflected things that weren't there. She believed the sickness wasn't just a disease, but a cleansing. It comes to take what the earth cannot hold anymore, she told a frightened farmer, who had stepped outside just long enough to ask them what they were doing. They didn't stay long. The farmer found a bundle of herbs by his gate the next morning, tied with twine. He didn't know what they meant, but he hung them over his hearth anyway, just in case. In the deeper woods, beyond the farthest farms, another story was unfolding. A woman named Katrin had lived there alone for years. She was once called a healer, sometimes a witch. People brought her eggs in exchange for tinctures. But when the sickness came, they stopped coming. Some feared she had brought it. Others simply vanished. Katrin, undisturbed, kept to her routine. She boiled mosses, ground stones into powder, and listened to the trees. One night, she heard a sound she hadn't heard in months, a knock. On the doorstep stood a man, his face half covered, eyes sunken. He didn't speak, just held out a small cloth. Inside was a medallion, a mark of the royal court. Katrin's eyes narrowed. She hadn't seen anything from the court in years. The man said only one word: help. She let him in. That same night, fires burned in the south. Villages were setting their own homes alight, not out of violence, but desperation. In places where the sickness had come and gone, people believed the wood itself had been cursed. Entire barns were dragged apart and burned under starlight. Some said they saw figures in the flames, faces, shapes. One boy claimed he saw a woman with silver eyes, smiling. No one believed him, but no one argued either. In one of these villages, an orphan named Anwin wandered from door to door with a doll in her hand. It had belonged to her sister, who no longer spoke. She sat on the steps of the old church now, staring at the sky all day. Anwin talked to the doll like it was alive. "They say the sickness comes when the moon turns too red," she whispered once. "But maybe it comes when people stop singing." She sang anyway. Further east, in a town ruled by stone walls and rusting gates, a record keeper named Father Guillaume kept the most complete list of deaths in the region. He wrote in the old ledger with careful strokes, noting name, age, and final symptom. But in recent weeks, he had started adding something new: dreams. Before dying, more and more people had begun to talk of identical dreams. A black road winding through a silver field, a door without hinges, a voice calling their name, but never speaking the words. Guillaume didn't know what to make of it, but he wrote it down anyway, in the margins, in smaller script. It felt important. But then he began dreaming too. One night, he woke up sweating, breath shallow. He had seen the road, and the voice had almost said his name. The next morning, he burned 3 pages of his own writing and refused to speak of it again. He kept working, but his hands trembled. All across the land, stories like these unfolded, quiet, strange, layered with doubt. People didn't understand what was happening, but they felt it was different now. The sickness wasn't just illness anymore. It had changed. It was watching, or listening, or waiting. And slowly, a deeper fear crept in. A question no one dared ask aloud. What if the sickness wasn't the enemy? What if it was only the beginning? Tension pulled across the land like thread. Weavers noticed their yarn snapped more often. Bakers said their bread wouldn't rise. Sleep grew harder to find. Light felt dimmer, even at noon, as if the world was bracing for something heavier, something worse. But no one knew what it was. Subtle things shifted. A man in a mining town lost track of time. Days vanished. He was found walking in circles, mumbling numbers. A child drew spirals on her walls, saying they protected her dreams. A hunter claimed animals had begun to gather, just watching. No movement, just long stares from deer and wolves alike. In the cities, the nobles spoke little of it. Their windows remained shuttered, their tables still full. But they too had begun writing letters in secret, sending them by riders in the dead of night. Letters marked with wax seals, shaped like keys. A new fear, hidden in gold-trimmed words. No one admitted it, but they knew. Whatever was coming, it hadn't arrived yet. And when it did, it would not knock. It would enter like a breath. And everything would change. Again, the rain came without thunder that night. Just a quiet, persistent drizzle that softened the earth and blurred the edges of the world. In the village of Dorn, the rooftops glistened under the gray sky as water trickled down gutters carved by generations of hands. No one walked the streets. Doors stayed closed. Windows remained shuttered, though flickers of candlelight trembled behind thin curtains. Inside one of the homes, a woman named Ira sat with her hands folded over a worn book. She didn't read from it anymore. The words had long since faded with use, and the ink had bled at the corners from years of damp. But she held it anyway, the way one holds a memory, not for meaning, but for comfort. Outside her cottage, the ivy had grown wild, wrapping its tendrils around the stone like it meant to hold the place together. Birds no longer nested in the thatch. Even the cat that once waited by her doorstep had vanished, as if called away by something only animals understood. Ira had once been known for her songs. She sang at births, at weddings, even during storms. Her voice had warmth, they said, like sunlight on a winter floor. But now she sang only in whispers, only to herself, and only when the shadows grew too long. Some evenings, she hummed the lullaby her mother used to sing. Others, she made up new melodies, ones no one else would ever hear. She did not know if her neighbors still lived. The houses around hers were too still, and she had not seen another face in days. But she lit her lamp each night and left a bowl of water by the gate. Small gestures, steady ones, kept her anchored. even when everything else felt uncertain. Far to the north, in a rocky fjord where sea met forest, an old lighthouse stood unused. Its lantern was broken, its stairs worn smooth by salt and wind. Yet someone had been there recently. Footprints in the wet moss, a tin cup left by the fire pit, and a bit of cloth snagged on the rusted iron rail. No one saw who came, and no one claimed the place. But the villagers nearby noticed something strange. They said that some nights, a light returned to the tower's window, not bright, but steady, as if someone had remembered its purpose. The fishermen who sailed under those cliffs swore they heard singing drifting across the water, too faint to place, too sorrowful to forget. In the great halls of the south, the sickness was spoken of in riddles now. The scholars had run out of explanations. Charts no longer matched reality. Symptoms defied pattern. One physician claimed the disease had begun mimicking human behavior, appearing only when it was ignored and vanishing when studied. Another claimed it was fear itself that gave it shape. The most desperate among them insisted that it had never been a disease at all, but something older, quieter, and far more patient. And still, across the land, small stories continued. A child in the mountains began painting eyes on stones and hiding them in trees. He said they were watching for the sickness so it couldn't sneak up anymore. A girl near the salt flats refused to sleep indoors, believing the sickness crept through roofs. She built a small shelter from driftwood and lay under the stars each night, listening to the wind as it combed through the dunes. In a once grand abbey, now half sunk into the marsh, a monk named Seraphine found himself alone after the others fled. At first, he rang the morning bell as usual. He tended the herbs, swept the steps, read aloud from the scriptures. But over time, the silence grew thicker, heavier. He started hearing things at dusk, a creak where no foot had fallen, the soft closing of a door that hadn't been opened in weeks. One night, he followed the sound to the old library. There, in the middle of the floor, was a book that hadn't been there before. It was open to a page he did not recognize, though it bore the abbey's mark. The writing was not Latin, nor French, nor any tongue he knew, but the symbols shimmered slightly, as if the page itself breathed. He closed the book gently and left it where it was. The next day it was gone. Seraphine told no one. Back in the forests of the east, the illness began changing again. This time, it did not bring fever or weakness. It brought dreams. Whole towns began speaking of shared visions, vivid and strange. A black river that ran uphill. A staircase with no end. A mirror that did not reflect. People described the same images, down to the color of the sky, the scent of the air, the feeling of being followed. They woke with tears in their eyes and could not explain why. A baker in a quiet hamlet carved one of these symbols into the dough before baking. A spiral with a single dot in the center. When the bread came out of the oven, he claimed it had no taste. None at all. He never baked again. Even the animals had begun to act differently. Flocks of birds flew in circles. Cows refused to cross certain fields. Dogs stood for hours at the corners of rooms, staring into nothing. Farmers began to mark their doors with soot or crushed ash, old traditions that no one remembered the meaning of. But still they did it, not for belief, but for hope. And all the while, the sickness, or whatever it had become, continued its slow, quiet path. Not loud, not violent, but steady. And in its wake, the world felt changed. Not destroyed, but altered, like a song sung in a different key. The old rhythms were harder to find. People forgot things more easily. Laughter, when it came, felt thinner. Sleep, more restless. And dreams deeper. A traveler named Corwin passed through several towns over the course of a single month. He kept a journal, not for others but for himself. Each night he wrote what he saw. Fewer people, stranger stories, colder winds, even in summer. One night he wrote a single line, "It doesn't want us dead. It wants us quiet." He never reached his destination, but his journal did. It was found in a sealed satchel beneath a stone archway, dry despite the rain, untouched by time. The pages smelled faintly of rosemary. And so the sickness moved on, still not fully known, still not fully understood. but felt in breath, in bone, in dreams. And though it had changed shape many times before, the worst of it, the final turn, the one no one could describe, had yet to come. And when it did, it would not need to knock. The storm had no thunder, but it left the sky stained with a strange reddish hue. People in the valleys didn't speak of it aloud, but they noticed. They paused longer at doorways, locked their windows tighter, and burned herbs they hadn't touched in years. The air had shifted. It felt charged, like a pause in the middle of a breath that never finished. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. In the village of Garen, the well went dry for the first time in living memory. The old women muttered prayers under their breath, while the children stood near the edge, dropping pebbles to listen for a splash. None came. That night, no lamps were lit. The village lay in darkness, not from powerlessness, but by choice. Something about light felt wrong, too loud, too noticeable. At the edge of the forest, a girl named Alice heard whispers. Not voices exactly, but sounds that moved like speech, shifts in the trees, clicking of branches, the soft scrape of wind against bark. She'd lived in the woods her whole life and had never felt afraid there. But now, she didn't go past the blackberry bushes. And when she did gather water from a stream, she carried a small charm her grandmother once gave her, a disc of wood marked with a simple line through the middle. She didn't know what it meant, only that it made her feel a little safer. That same week, word began to spread of a town that vanished. Not burned, not buried, just gone. A trader passed through the region and swore there had once been a place called Brain, a quiet farming town with goats and sweet bread and a steeple bell that rang twice each dawn. But when he returned with his second cart, there was nothing but open field. The trees were wrong, as if they'd grown into space that should have belonged to roads. There were no ruins. No ruins meant no fire. No signs of panic. It was like the land had never been lived on. People dismissed him at first. Too much dust in his lungs. Too many lonely roads. But others began to talk. They remembered Brain, a cousin who lived there, a recipe that came from its bakers, a tune once played at a wedding. And now, it was like the place had been erased from the world's memory. Even the maps looked different, the name quietly missing from the margins. In the Abbey of Arlane, Brother Tomas, who had once recorded weather patterns, now filled his pages with drawings. Circles upon circles, stars with no sky, trees with roots growing upward. The head abbot asked him to stop, to return to his duties, but Tomas only said, "It's getting closer." He didn't know what it was, but he felt it behind every shadow, in the quiet between bells. He stopped sleeping. He refused to look in mirrors. One morning, his bed was empty. His drawings remained, tacked across every wall of his cell, ceiling to floor. The sickness had stopped being a sickness. No one even used the word anymore. Instead, they talked about the quiet or the change. Some said it was a curse, others a sign. A few believed it was the earth resetting itself. What they agreed on was that it was no longer just physical. People who weren't sick were forgetting things, names, songs, entire days. A baker lost the recipe her mother taught her. A hunter forgot the woods he'd walked since childhood. A woman held her newborn and couldn't remember the name she'd chosen. Time felt soft. Sleep, heavier. Dreams lasted longer than waking. And in those dreams, the same images returned again and again. Those symbols carved into old beams, drawn in ash, painted on barn walls by hands no one remembered. Always the same, a gate with no hinges, a river with no sound, a tall figure at the edge of the frame, always just far enough to be unclear. In a quiet northern province, where hills rolled like waves, a strange occurrence was recorded by 3 separate travelers. Each arrived days apart, each from a different direction. They did not know one another, yet all of them described the same thing. A long procession of people moving slowly across the horizon, silent, eyes closed, walking in perfect unison. None carried bags. None spoke. They simply walked, as if drawn by a string through their chests. The travelers tried calling out. No one turned. By the time villagers arrived to investigate, the field was empty. No footprints remained. Even the animals had gone still. In the heart of the old kingdom, near the ruins of an ancient fort, A child named Theo began to sing in a language no one recognized. He had never learned to read, never left the village, but the words rolled from his mouth in slow rhythm, each syllable precise. His mother wept quietly. Her son had not spoken in weeks, not since the fever took his father. The boy now only sang at dusk, staring into the treetops. The villagers listened with both awe and dread. They began marking their doors with circles and chalk, matching the rhythm of his song. Every night, the sky grew redder at the horizon. The stars didn't twinkle the same. Some nights, they didn't twinkle at all. Others they moved. And still, no one understood what was happening. The physicians stopped trying to find causes. The priests stopped promising answers. The old ones simply sat near the fire and watched the smoke as it curled like a ribbon into the dark. Then, without warning, across the land the dreams changed. No longer symbols, no longer fog. Now was a place people had never seen, yet all remembered. Endless corridors carved into the earth. Walls of salt, a ceiling that pulsed like breath. And in the center, a sound, not loud, not soft, just steady, like something ancient waking up. People across villages, towns, and cities began drawing the same place in dirt and soot, on cloth and slate. The same room, the same hallway, the same feeling of being called toward it. And then the silence deepened, not just in sound, but in spirit. Voices quieted. Laughter stopped. The birds, already fewer, now left entirely. Trees no longer creaked in the wind. Even the rivers, once filled with gentle babble, now ran without sound, as if the world was holding its breath. The sickness, or whatever had taken its place, was nearing its peak, not of death, but of change. It had crept slowly, like a shadow stretching across a sundial. And now, it hovered at the edge of something no one could name. The final symptom, they whispered, wasn't fever. It was forgetting the world had ever been different. And yet, somewhere deep in the dark, something still waited. Not a cure, not an end, but a choice. One that hadn't yet been made, and one that, once made, could never be undone. The hour was close, and the silence was listening. The sun didn't rise the way it used to. It came up slow, dull without warmth, just a pale shape behind a veil of mist. It lit the land in grays and browns, draining color from trees, buildings, and faces. People stopped watching for it. They just moved through the hours, unsure where morning ended and night began. And still, the dreams returned. They no longer visited in pieces. Now they came whole, full scenes, full voices. Whole crowds gathered in sleep, walking through the corridors with no roof, following the pulse of the earth. The images were shared by people who had never met. A fisherwoman in the east, a blacksmith in the west, a boy in the deep forests, they all saw the same place. And always the same sound, a rhythm like breathing and whispering all at once. Not frightening, but impossible to forget. In the capital, the royal court gathered in secret. The nobles wore heavy cloaks and spoke with shallow voices. They didn't ask what the sickness was anymore. They asked where it would stop, but no one could answer. Messengers sent beyond the kingdom returned confused, if they returned at all. Maps no longer aligned with the land. Roads twisted, rivers flowed differently, and in some places time seemed to shift, days repeating, nights stretching longer than they should. One scholar, pale from lack of sleep, stood and finally said it aloud. "This isn't a plague," she whispered. "It's a turning." The silence that followed her words was not fear. It was recognition. The people had not been waiting for a cure. They had been waiting to understand what was being asked of them. In a small mountain chapel, high above the tree line, a gathering took place. Not a sermon, not a ceremony, just a quiet sitting. People came from nearby villages, carrying nothing. They sat on the floor, around the old stone altar, and they did not speak. They simply closed their eyes and listened. There was no instruction, no leadership, but they all heard it, just beneath their breath, just behind their heartbeat. That sound again, a low hum, rising slowly. For hours, they sat, and as they did, something shifted, not outside, but within. The fear that had filled them for so long, the dread of sickness, the fear of forgetting, began to fade. not because they understood, but because they accepted they might not need to. There was something older moving through the land, something deeper than disease. It wasn't killing them. It was changing them. In the valley below, a girl who had not spoken for months opened her mouth and said, "It's remembering." Her mother wept. Elsewhere, a boy climbed the steps of a ruined tower and shouted a name he did not know, a name that felt like it belonged to him. A shepherd saw his flock return after days missing, and they knelt in the field as if listening to something he couldn't hear. And then the final dream came. It came on the same night to all who had seen the others. Not a corridor, not a hall, a garden, but not made of flowers. It was made of stone, of smoke, of wind. It had trees with roots that floated, leaves that shimmered in place, and a sky the color of ash. And in the middle, a figure. Tall, still, wrapped in a cloak made of wind. Its face was not cruel. It had no face at all, but it watched. And every dreamer, without words, felt the same thing. This was the source, not a sickness, but of choice, a memory, a judgment, and a question. The figure raised its hand, not to strike, not to bless, just to offer, a single movement. And suddenly, they all understood. This was not death. It never had been. It was invitation to let go of noise, of hunger, of the old way of moving through the world, to become something quieter, more connected, more still, not erased, but changed. It was the final symptom, the final truth. The deadliest disease in medieval history had not been meant to kill. It had been meant to wake them up. The plague was never just a sickness of the body. It was a quiet unraveling of everything they thought could not change: traditions, language, memory, time. It had not come to destroy. It had come to offer a different way forward, but only if they chose it, and not all would. Some would cling to the old paths, the old fears. Others would listen to the stillness, follow the dreams, light the lamps in empty towers just in case someone else was out there doing the same. The choice was theirs. The moment was now, and the figure in the garden waited, its hand still outstretched. And far below, in a field wrapped in morning mist, a woman stepped barefoot into the grass and closed her eyes. She had dreamed of the gate, of a symbol, of the hum beneath the earth, and she was no longer afraid. She whispered one word. Then the wind rose, the light returned, and everything began to turn. The breeze that swept across the fields felt different now. Not colder, not stronger, just clearer. It carried no scent of sickness, no weight of dread. It was as if the world had finally exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Across the land, people stirred not with urgency, but with calm, like waking from a deep sleep they didn't know they were in. In the village of Senlac, where the windows had been shuttered for months, the curtains were drawn back one by one. People blinked into the soft daylight. Some stepped outside and stood barefoot in the dirt just to feel the ground. No one rushed. There were no crowds. Only quiet, steady motion, as if everyone had somehow decided together, without speaking, that it was time. In a small cottage at the edge of the woods, Alice sat beside her grandmother's hearth. The fire crackled gently. The charm she once carried everywhere, the carved wooden disc, now lay resting on the mantel. She didn't feel the need to hold it anymore. Outside, the trees still whispered, but it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like a song. And in the mountains above, the last of the snow melted faster than expected. Water trickled through narrow streams, winding down into the valleys like veins bringing new life. Along the old paths, flowers began blooming where no one had planted them. Pale blue, soft violet, small white petals curled like shells. The kind of flowers that bloom only after long winters. The illness had not returned, not as a fever, not as a shadow. Instead, it left traces in other ways. A woman who once lost her memory now remembered the smell of her mother's bread. A man who had forgotten how to speak found his voice again while naming stars to a child. A boy who had once buried stones behind a church now sat in the grass beside them, carving stories instead of names. The change hadn't erased anyone. It had simply made space for something new to grow. In a quiet village square, where no markets had gathered in months, a single bell rang. Noah had pulled its rope. It just rang, once soft and clear. No one rushed to find the cause. They just listened. And in that sound, something old was remembered. Not a ritual, not a law, just a truth, that not all endings are cruel. Some are openings. In the stillness, a boy who had dreamed the most dreamed no more. He woke each morning clear-eyed, steady. He no longer needed the drawings. He had folded them into small birds and let the wind take them from his windowsill. Each bird held a piece of the story, floating gently across the hills, resting on roofs, caught in tree branches. Small messages without words. He had seen the garden. He had made his choice. And now he simply lived. In the deep woods, Katrin the healer still mixed her herbs, still boiled water. But she smiled more often. She had not seen the pale traveler again, but the medallion he'd carried remained on her shelf. A reminder that even in fear, people still reached for one another. That was the part of the change that no one could explain, how it had pulled them closer, even when it pushed them apart. Not everyone returned. Not every house was reopened. Some doors stayed shut. Some fields lay fallow. But even in loss, there was quiet understanding now. Grief walked more gently through the villages. It no longer shouted. It sat beside people and listened. And sometimes it even sang. In the city, the scholars reopened their halls, not to teach, but to listen. They brought in the old, the quiet, the forgotten, and asked them to speak. Not of books or rules, but of moments. How they knew when the rain would come. How they remembered lullabies. How they found stillness. The knowledge that returned was not written down, but it filled the rooms with warmth. The nobles lowered their banners. The priests stopped asking for gold. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, in a place no longer dreamed but now remembered, the garden remained. No longer hidden, no longer veiled. It waited with its strange sky and living stones. And though the cloaked figure had vanished, its presence remained like an echo, not of command, but of invitation. It had asked nothing, and yet offered everything. Now the world was softer. Not perfect, not healed in every way, but softer. People sang again, not loudly, not all at once, but in corners, in kitchens, in the pauses between chores. Songs without names. Songs without fear. Just songs. The sickness that once stole breath had become something else. A turning, a remembering, a slow unwrapping of what had always been beneath the noise. The need for quiet, for care, for listening. In the last light of a day that felt different from all the rest, an old man sat by a stone wall. He had seen much. He had forgotten even more. But now, as the wind moved gently through his hair and the grass swayed like waves, he smiled. He didn't know what tomorrow would be, but for the first time in many seasons, he wasn't afraid of it. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the earth breathe around him. And somewhere nearby, a lantern was lit, not out of fear but hope, just in case someone was still walking through the night, looking for home. But just as the world had begun to settle into its new stillness, just when the weight of the long sickness had lifted and people had started to breathe differently again, something strange returned. Not the fear, not the fever, but a flicker, a sense, like an old shadow stepping back into the edge of the room. It wasn't loud and it wasn't fast. It came like a chill that didn't belong to the wind. It began with the children. Not all, but some. Those who had been quietest through the years of silence. Those who never quite cried during the worst of the sickness. Those who always seemed to be listening to something others couldn't hear. They began waking in the night, sitting upright in their beds. Not screaming, not speaking. Just staring toward the windows, toward the trees, toward places no one could see. One boy in a fishing town rose just before dawn and walked barefoot to the sea. His mother followed quietly, frightened but too unsure to stop him. He stood at the edge of the tide, eyes wide open, lips moving but no sound escaping. When she reached him, he looked up and whispered something she didn't understand, a word she couldn't remember a moment later. And then he blinked, smiled, and asked what was for breakfast, as if nothing had happened. But it kept happening, in different places, on different nights. The same behavior, the same gaze, the same word that slipped out of memory like water through cracks. In the mountains, A young girl who hadn't spoken since her father passed began drawing new shapes in the soil. Circles within squares, lines that led nowhere. Her grandmother, who once saw the dreams too, recognized one of the symbols. It had been carved into the archway of the forgotten chapel just before the roof collapsed. The villagers called it the Old Mark, a sign of blessing or warning, no one was sure which. But it hadn't been seen in years. Now it was appearing in dirt, in fog windows, in frost on barn doors, and once, in the ashes of a cold hearth. People didn't speak of it openly yet. There was a deep desire not to break the fragile calm that had just returned. But in their bones, they knew something had stirred again. Something that hadn't gone fully quiet, only waited. And then the letters came. Handwritten, sealed with wax. No return name. Delivered by birds no one had trained and left in places no one should have reached. One was found tucked between the pages of a book that hadn't been opened in a decade. Another slid from a broken flute left at a child's grave. A third fell from the rafters of an old monastery during prayer. Each letter bore only a short phrase, written in the same hand. The gate is opening again. Not a threat, not a curse, just a statement. Like a reminder, like a clock quietly ticking toward something. The scholars were the first to panic. Not because of the phrase, but because of what it meant. The gate, mentioned in dreams, drawn in symbols, whispered about in fevered murmurs, was thought to be symbolic. An idea, a metaphor. But now, something about the way the children spoke, the way the animals moved, the timing of the dreams returning, it felt physical, real. And if it was real, then it could open. And if it opened, the boy with the birds, Theo, began waking with blood at his nose. Not from sickness, but from sound. He said the sky was humming again, only now it was louder. It wasn't music this time. It was counting down. But to what? In the capital, beneath the stone foundations of the old archive tower, workers uncovering a collapsed staircase found something strange. A door carved directly into the stone, not just built over, but embedded in it. And on the door, no lock, no handle, just a marking, the same symbol seen in the children's drawings. A single line through an open circle. The worker who touched it first fell unconscious. When he awoke, he couldn't speak, only draw. And what he drew was a map, not of the kingdom, not of any known land, but of the dream corridor, the exact layout, down to the length between each hallway, down to the symbol on the garden stones. The abbot, shown the sketches, went silent for a full minute. Then he whispered, "We were never dreaming. We were remembering." News of the discovery spread slowly, only to those who could be trusted, or thought they could, because soon after, another twist appeared, this time from the sea. Fishermen off the western coast reported an island that shouldn't exist. Not new, old, but one that had never been marked, never noticed. It wasn't large. Just a lump of land with a single stone spire at its center. Black rock, no vegetation, just a sound, low and steady, humming beneath the waves. They didn't dock, they didn't dare, but they threw weighted lines into the water and claimed the sea beneath the island was warm, boiling warm, even in midwinter. One of the younger sailors said it smelled like the same herbs the monks used during funerals. The old man beside him didn't reply, because he was crying. He had dreamed of that island once, 60 years ago, and in the dream, he had been standing on it, looking at the sky as it blinked. Not the stars, the sky, like an eye, watching back. And now, that island was real. The map Theo had drawn matched the shape of it exactly. And deep in the ruined abbey where Brother Seraphine once vanished, a new figure had been seen by a traveler, only for a moment. Cloaked, still, watching from the tree line, just as it had been in the garden. But this time, it wasn't a dream. This time it was real, and it was closer, much closer. Night fell slower than usual. The sky didn't turn black right away. Instead, it held onto a dull red glow, like embers stretching across the horizon, refusing to go out. People noticed. They stopped what they were doing and looked up, not in fear, just in silence. Something about the way the light hung in the air made them stand still, like even their breath should be quiet now. In the highlands, the wind paused. Trees, which always danced with the smallest breeze, stood frozen. Leaves didn't rustle. The air didn't move. Birds were nowhere to be seen. And then the sound returned. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even near. But people heard it everywhere. Not with their ears, but inside. Like a memory, humming beneath the surface. A steady rhythm. A low pulse. Familiar. Unsettling. Children stopped mid-step. Elderly men and women lifted their eyes at the same time. Animals pricked their ears. Somewhere far away, a bell rang. But no hand had touched it. The gate was opening. No one said out loud. They didn't have to. They felt it, as surely as they felt the sun's warmth or the cold of snow. It wasn't something they could resist. It wasn't asking permission. It was happening, slowly, patiently, as if the world had been waiting for this moment far longer than they had even existed. In the Capitol, the hidden door below the archive tower began to glow. Only slightly. A faint silver line along the edges. No flames. No sparks. Just light, pure, pulsing alive. The workers were ordered away. Guards posted. But the light didn't stop. It pulsed in rhythm with the dreams. And on the third night, the stone began to change. It didn't crumble. It softened, as though it had never been stone at all, but something else disguised for centuries. Something now waking up. And in the north, under the full moon, the cloaked figure walked. No longer hidden. No longer part of a dream. It walked through villages without speaking. It passed empty homes. It stopped near doorways. And everywhere it stepped, things began to remember. Not change. Remember. A child who had forgotten how to speak whispered a lullaby she'd never been taught. A woman who had lost her husband to the sickness smiled for the first time in years. A blind man saw light through his closed eyelids. It wasn't performing miracles. It was returning things. Pieces that had been lost. Fragments of memory. Whispers of meaning. Not everyone saw the figure clearly. To some, it appeared as a man. To others, a woman. Some said it was tall and shining. Others said it was made of shadow and stars. Some claimed it wasn't a figure at all, but a feeling. A warmth. A breath. A voice without words. But whatever it was, it moved closer to the gate. Closer to the place buried in dreams. In a field near the coast, Theo stood alone. He had been walking for 3 days, led by nothing but a feeling. No map. No compass. Just a rhythm in his chest. And now he stood facing the sea, where the new island waited in silence. It wasn't smoking. It wasn't glowing. It simply was. A black stone, rising from the waves, with no birds on its cliffs, no grass on its soil. At the center of it, a spire. No door. No windows. Just height. And something inside it. Watching. Waiting. Theo didn't need a boat. He simply stepped into the water. And the sea parted. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough. A narrow path revealed beneath his feet, as though the world had been hiding it, saving it for this moment. He walked. The waves stayed low. The wind did not howl. The stars did not move. He walked until he reached the base of the island, and the spire began to hum. Not in warning. In welcome. Meanwhile, in the old abbey, the monks gathered again. They had long abandoned the old rituals. Now, they only sat in silence. And on that night, they heard the voice. Not in their ears, but in their hearts. You were never meant to survive unchanged. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth. This was not punishment. It was remembering. One monk cried. Another smiled. A third simply stood and walked into the woods, barefoot, toward the sound only he could hear. The sickness had been a messenger, not of death, but of return. Return to a memory too deep to speak. Return to something older than words. And now, the final moment had come. The gate was no longer sealed, and those who had heard the hum in their sleep, those who had seen the corridor in their dreams, those who had touched the truth at the edge of forgetting, they were being called. Not to a war, not to a trial, to a choice. To step through, or to stay behind. And for those who stepped through, nothing would ever be the same. But neither would the world they left. Because now, the gate was open, and the figure had arrived. Not to rule, not to destroy, but to lead them forward. One breath at a time. The spire did not open with noise. It breathed. A A slow, steady exhale, as if it had been holding something inside for centuries and could finally release it into the air again. The island didn't shake. The waves didn't rise. The sky didn't darken. Everything remained still, except for the light. It began to rise from the seams of the stone. Not blinding, not wild, just soft, like dawn behind heavy clouds. Theo stood at the base, hands at his sides, eyes wide but unafraid. He didn't ask what to do. He didn't need to. The humming was inside him now, not around him. He stepped forward, and the stone gave way, not cracked, not broken, but folded, like fabric drawn back to reveal a passage. Warm air rose from within, scented faintly with earth and lavender. He looked back once, not in fear, not in longing, just in recognition. Then he stepped through. He was not the only one. Across the world, others were arriving. Some by forest path, some from crumbling towers, some from dreams they never woke from. They walked without questions because the questions had all been asked already, during long nights of fever, during quiet mornings by graves, during years when hope felt like a fragile thread. This was not a place of answers. It was a place beyond them. Inside the spire, there was no throne, no leader, no altar, only light, and within that light, memory of lives lived long before the sickness, of choices made and forgotten, of kindnesses never spoken aloud, of griefs too deep to name. It was all there, held in warmth, not judged but witnessed. The kind of witnessing that brings peace, the kind that lets things rest. Theo closed his eyes and let it surround him. He saw his father, smiling. He saw the old stories his grandmother told, now glowing like constellations. He saw people he had never met, but somehow knew. He saw himself, not just as he was, but as he had been, as he could be, whole, small, human, and enough. Elsewhere, in the hills above the capital, Iris sat by her window. She had not walked far in years. But that night she stood. She walked out her door, barefoot, hair loose, and followed the scent of rosemary and rain. The trees seemed to open for her. The ground didn't tire her. Every step felt like part of memory returning. She didn't see the figure waiting ahead, but she felt it. Not a stranger, not a god, just someone who had been walking too, and now had come to walk with her. The monks in our lane sang that evening, not from habit, not from ritual, but because the silence inside them had become too full to hold. Their voices rose gently, cracked and low but strong. The melody was not old. It had never been taught, but every voice joined. Even the birds returned, perching in the arches, not to echo but to listen. The sickness had ended, not because a cure was found, but because the world had changed around it, because the people no longer feared the quiet. They welcomed it. They learned to listen again, to each other, to the earth, to the breath between questions. And slowly, gently, things began to bloom. Not all at once, not loudly, but in small ways. A child remembered their name. A river began to sing again. A wind chime rang in a home thought empty. A door once closed was left ajar, and someone came in, not to take but to sit. In time, the dreams faded, not because they were untrue, but because they had served their purpose. The memory had returned. The turning had happened, and the world remembered how to begin again. The figure was never seen again after that, but its presence lingered in the rhythm of footsteps, in the pause before a song, in the soft way people began to greet each other again, not just with words, but with eyes, with warmth, with knowing. The gate did not close. It remained, quiet, waiting, not for destruction, not for another sickness, but for the next forgetting and the next remembering, because that, after all, was the nature of things. We forget, we remember, we change, and somewhere in between, we find each other again, in silence, in song, in breath, and in stories. The sky above the spire pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of something too large to understand. Inside, Theo stood at the center of the light, still and silent, letting it wash over him like a tide. He had no way of knowing that, at that same moment, far across the sea, others were reaching the edge too. Not just the children, not just the dreamers, but ordinary people, carpenters, midwives, farmers, who had followed the feeling without understanding why. Some came in silence, others in prayer, and some with nothing left but curiosity. And the spire, alive in ways no one had imagined, responded, not with thunder or fire, but with remembering. Inside, the air shimmered. It wasn't just memory now. It was motion. The walls pulsed with images from a time no one alive had seen. Fleeting moments, laughing faces, shouting at markets, hands holding each other after loss, whole seasons flashing like candlelight, gone too soon, but beautiful while they burned. Theo reached out, and instead of seeing the past, he felt it, as if the very stones around him had absorbed not the events, but the emotions, the fear, the joy, the surrender, the hope. All the while the hum grew. Outside the spire, those who had gathered began to feel it too. Their skin prickled. Their hearts beat in rhythm with the sound. And though no one spoke it aloud, they all knew they had come to witness the end of something. Or maybe the beginning. It wasn't clear which, but it was close now. They could feel the turning of it, the tilt of the world preparing for a new shape. Then the ground shifted. Not a quake, just a breath drawn deep into the earth. A low, slow inhale. And beneath their feet, the stones glowed faintly. Lines stretched across the soil, connecting people, places, memories. Not chains, but threads. Thin as silk, strong as bone. Every step they had taken, every dream they had followed, every fear they had faced, it had brought them here. To this moment. Inside the spire, Theo whispered the only word that came to him. I remember. The light responded. It rose, not toward the ceiling, but outward, passing through the walls, sweeping across the sea, the hills, the forests. A wave of stillness, of warmth, of something too old and too human to name. It didn't blind anyone. It didn't burn, but it moved through them like a second heartbeat. And in that instant, everything became quiet. Not empty, not gone, just still. The wind paused. The waves hushed. Even the birds, which had just returned, fell silent on the branches. In a village where the sickness had first been named, where the fever once took entire families in a single night, a boy who had been mute for 3 years turned to his sister and spoke. Not much, just her name, but it was enough to make her drop to her knees in the dirt and weep. In the forest, where the symbol had first been carved in a bark by hands no one could trace, the trees bent slightly, not broken, not falling, but bowing. The animals stood in the open, watching, waiting. And in the capital, deep beneath the archive tower, the sealed door opened with no key. Behind it, not a corridor, not a chamber, but a mirror, tall and curved, framed in old metal, clouded like fog, and it showed no reflection, only light. Back at the spire, Theo stepped forward into the core of the chamber. It wasn't a throne room. It wasn't a hall. It was just a space. Open, soft, warm. At the very center, a pool, not of water, but of memory. He saw it shimmer, and inside he saw the cloaked figure again. It stood waiting. No face, no voice, but presence. And this time it reached out, not to take him, not to lead him, but to join him. And Theo understood. The sickness had never been about survival. Not really. It had been about reunion. Between past and present, between self and truth, between the forgotten and the remembered. He took the figure's hand, and the spire pulsed one last time. The light shot up into the sky, carving through clouds, touching stars. For one breathless second, the entire world seemed to stop. And then everything resumed, but differently. People didn't vanish. Cities didn't fall. Nothing exploded, but people began to dream again. Not strange dreams of symbols or corridors, but clear ones. Dreams of people they had lost. Dreams of laughter, soft and close. Dreams of a world that didn't have to be rebuilt, just remembered. In the weeks that followed, the fever didn't return. The humming faded. The spire stood quiet. But something had changed. The land healed faster. Words once forgotten came easily again. And every now and then, when someone looked just right at the edge of shadow, they could still see a shape, tall, still, watching, but always from a distance. Until one day, Long after Theo had disappeared, a child born under the red sky asked a question that surprised everyone. Who made the sickness stop? The elders exchanged looks. There was no answer in the books. But one woman finally replied, her voice soft with memory. We did. We just had to remember how. And for a moment, the wind whispered again. But this time, it sounded like a lullaby. And the trees once more began to sing. The world didn't rush to celebrate. No parades were held, no horns blown, no flags raised. Instead, the shift was quiet, so quiet that some people didn't even notice it at first. But over time, something became clear. The land itself had softened. People didn't speak as loudly. Even footsteps seemed slower, more thoughtful. There was no need to run anymore. The thing they were running from had passed. The sickness that had once silenced whole villages became something people spoke of with care. Not as a curse, not as a punishment, but as a great pause. A moment in history when the world had been asked to sit still and listen. And for once, it had obeyed. People still remembered the pain, of course. The losses were real. The goodbyes that came without answers. The doors that never reopened. The names etched into stone. Those wounds didn't disappear. But they changed shape. They became part of the songs people sang quietly while working. Part of the way they held each other a little longer than before. Part of how they listened when someone else spoke. Theo was never seen again. His story was told and retold in different ways. Some said he became a part of the spire itself, living inside its light forever. Others believed he had simply walked out the other side, into a world no one else could see. A place beyond time, beyond fear, where memories didn't fade and silence wasn't empty. A few believed he still walked among them, just in a different form. As a breeze through trees, as the flicker in a candle, as the sound of a name spoken just before waking. In one small town, near the river, a girl who had never seen the ocean began to paint it perfectly, wave for wave, rock for rock. When asked how, she only shrugged and said, "He showed me." The gate, wherever it truly was, remained untouched. Not because it was sealed, but because it didn't need to open anymore. It had already done what it was meant to do. It had connected something, not only between people, but between memory and meaning, between forgetting and knowing. It had reminded the world that some answers don't come from looking forward, but from looking within. Years passed. Crops grew stronger. Storms became gentler. People worked side by side more easily than before. No one talked much about kings or crowns anymore. The ones who tried to rule loudly found themselves ignored. Authority had shifted quietly, slowly, to those who listened best, not those who shouted loudest. And the ones who listened were often the ones who had once been ignored. The old women, the children, the quiet healers. People began asking them what they dreamed. And what they dreamed was always the same. Light through trees, humming below stone, laughter that came not from joy but from deep, deep peace. No one built monuments to the sickness. No statues were carved. No cities were named. The people had no interest in remembering the pain that way. Instead, they planted gardens, not just near homes, but along roads, at crossroads, beside rivers, places where people could sit and be still. Every garden was different, some wild, some tended, some filled with herbs, others just rocks and wind chimes. But all of them were places where silence was welcome, where people could sit without speaking, where no one asked you to explain anything. A new kind of ritual quietly emerged. People began to leave small tokens in these gardens. Not coins or gold, but memories. A thread from a mother's shawl, a drawing from a child, a handful of dirt from a buried root. They didn't leave names. There was no need. The land remembered for them. And sometimes, only sometimes, if the wind was just right and the garden very quiet, they heard a hum beneath the soil. Faint, familiar. They didn't fear it anymore. They smiled, because now they understood. The deadliest diseases in history had never truly been about death. They were messages, reminders, long-forgotten letters from the earth to its people. They said, slow down. Pay attention. Let go. Return. The sickness had asked them all a question. The people had answered, not with words but with change. with gentleness, with care. And the earth, listening as it always had, breathed again. Somewhere far off, in the mountains where the first dreams were shared, a new child was born. They had no fever, no visions, but when they cried, it sounded like a song everyone recognized but couldn't place. And the midwife, who had once lost 3 children to the fever, didn't cry this time. She just held the baby close and whispered, "You remember too, don't you?" The baby blinked slowly. Outside the window, the sky was the color of dawn, and in the distance, the sea sighed, and the trees leaned inward, as if listening once again. The figure in the cloak was never seen again. But sometimes, on long walks at dusk, someone would turn suddenly, sure they had just seen a shadow that didn't belong. And they wouldn't run. They wouldn't speak. They would just stand still, listening. Then they'd smile and walk on, because they knew now, some things don't return to scare us. They return to remind us, to breathe, to wait, to begin again. And that, in the end, was what the sickness gave back. Not fear, but a second chance to be fully human. In the years that followed, the world became something quieter. Not empty, not simple, just quieter. People still worked the land, still sang to their children, still argued over bread and weather. But underneath everything, there was a gentleness that hadn't been there before. It was like the memory of the sickness had changed how the world breathed. There were no more cures to chase, no more plagues to run from. Only the long task of remembering how to live with each other. Villages that had once turned inward began to open again, not with walls falling or flags raised, but with something smaller. A traveler offered shelter instead of being turned away. A loaf of bread was left on a doorstep without a name. A lantern was kept lit at night in case someone lost their way home. These weren't grand gestures. They were human ones. They were the kinds of things people forgot they could do. In one forgotten village where the fever had taken nearly all, a garden grew wild. It wasn't planted. It simply appeared, flowers no one could name, vines climbing over stone, roots breaking through long-abandoned doorways. People began to visit it in silence. They didn't speak there. They just walked slowly, touching petals, resting their hands on old wood, letting their feet sink into soft earth. No one claimed it. No one cleaned it. It was left exactly as it was. And that was enough. Children born after the fever knew only the stories. But those stories shaped them. They grew up knowing the sky could change without warning, that silence could speak louder than sound. That light didn't always mean safety, but sometimes it did. They didn't fear the gate. They didn't search for the spire. They simply lived, carrying a quiet wisdom in their eyes that even their parents couldn't explain. One such child, Amar, a boy with quiet hands and a steady gaze, liked to sit by the river that ran past the orchard. He carved small boats from bark and watched them drift. He never named the boats. He never chased them downstream. But sometimes, as the light hit the water just right, he saw reflections that didn't belong. Faces not his own, places he'd never visited. They weren't frightening, just familiar. He never told anyone. He didn't think he needed to. In the north, a small group of old women began gathering at twilight. They didn't follow a calendar. They didn't wear robes or carry books. They just came when the sky turned orange, and they sat in a circle, humming songs no one taught them. People started calling them the Wind Sisters, though none of them had sisters. Their songs didn't rhyme. They had no chorus. But when they sang, animals came close, and people slept easier. A few tried to record the melodies, but the notes never sounded the same on paper. They only lived in breath. Somewhere beyond the edge of the known lands, where the sea met the cliffs and the stars touched the earth, a traveler found the spire again. It was quiet, cold to the touch, covered in moss. He didn't go inside. He just sat beside it for a long time. Hours, maybe days. He left a small feather on the threshold and walked away without looking back. When someone asked him later why he went, he said, "To be remembered." Even the animals seemed to shift. Birds that had once vanished now nested closer to people. Deer wandered into towns without fear. A fox followed a girl home once and stayed by her gate for 3 nights. On the 4th night, she woke from a dream where the fox spoke to her, not in words, but in pictures. When she opened her eyes, it was gone, but a small pile of stones was left at her door in the shape of a spiral. These small things weren't called miracles. They weren't seen as proof or prophecy. People didn't argue about them. They just accepted them the way they accepted seasons changing, as something natural, even if it couldn't be explained. And in that acceptance, something powerful grew. Not faith, not doctrine, but peace. The kind that sits in the chest without needing permission. The kind that makes space. The kind that remembers quietly, without bitterness or fear. The sickness that had once brought so much death had become a shadow, still present, but no longer sharp. Like a scar on the skin that no longer aches. Like a song remembered only by the rhythm it left behind. Those who had walked through the gate were never forgotten. They became part of the soil, part of the wind, part of the space between each breath. People didn't worship them. They didn't build temples. They simply told their names to children when the stars were bright, and said, "These are the ones who remembered for us." And the gate, though never seen again, was said to hum gently beneath the earth when the world grew too loud. Not to warn, not to punish, just to remind, to be still, to listen, to let go of fear and return to something older than pain. By the time Amar was old enough to carve full-size boats, he no longer saw strange faces in the water. Instead, he saw his own, calm, focused, at peace. He never left the village. He never needed to. People came to him, not for advice, not for prophecy, but just to sit by the river and watch bark boats drift toward a horizon no one tried to control. And on one very still evening, as the sun dipped below the orchard line and the air smelled faintly of rosemary, he looked up and whispered, "I remember now." No one was around to hear him, but the wind shifted, and the boat he had just placed in the river caught a strange current and sailed a little farther than usual, beyond the bend, beyond the bridge, beyond where most people could see, but not beyond where it mattered, because some memories don't need to be chased. They just need to be trusted and carried forward, gently, like breath, like story, like sleep. By the time the leaves began to change again, few people spoke of the sickness by name, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been woven into everything else, like a thread of dark blue in a blanket of softer colors. It was part of the pattern now, not the whole design. People no longer needed to name it to remember what it had taught them. The new generation lived differently. Not better, not more beautifully, but more gently. They didn't chase things as hard as the ones before. They didn't run from silence. They weren't afraid to be still. In small villages across the coast, and in valleys where the mist hung low, children were taught something older than letters. They were taught to pause when the wind changed, to hum when they were lonely, to sit with someone who cried without needing to fix the reason. These are the things that lasted. There was an old man who lived at the edge of the stone fields, where no crops grew and the wind always seemed to be whispering. No one knew where he came from, but the children liked to sit with him in the evenings. He told no stories. He didn't speak much at all, but when he did, it was always something simple. A sentence, a question, a truth. Once a small boy asked him what he thought the sickness really was. The old man just smiled, pointed to the sky, then to the soil beneath them, and said, "It was a breath we hadn't listened to." That was all. But the boy remembered. And when he grew older and had children of his own, he told them the same thing, except he added something the old man hadn't said. And now we do listen. People began building benches where they once built walls. They left fruit on stone ledges for anyone who passed by. They painted birds on door frames. They lit candles not to chase darkness, but to welcome it kindly when it came. There was no more fear in being alone, because solitude had become sacred, and community had become a quiet bond, not a loud promise. Even in cities, where noise had once drowned everything, people began to move slower. They started growing herbs in corners where concrete had cracked. They wrote poems on scraps of wood and tucked them into the spaces between buildings. Music returned, but softer. Less drums, more strings, less shouting, more hums, and the stars felt closer than before. Maybe they always had been, but people were finally looking up again. No one searched for the gate anymore, not because it was hidden, but because they understood now it had always been inside them. Every choice to forgive, every moment of stillness, every kindness offered without expectation. These are small openings, and together, they kept the world breathing. A boy named Jorin, who had never dreamed during the fever years, began to sleep deeply once the gardens returned. In his dreams, he visited places that felt familiar but couldn't be named. Long halls lined with wind chimes, stone staircases wrapped in vines, a shore made of smooth glass where the sky rippled like silk. He never feared these places. He walked through them with bare feet and open eyes. And when he woke, he remembered them, not as dreams but as visits, as if sleep had become a bridge, not an escape. One morning, he brought his mother a drawing. It showed a circle inside a square, surrounded by tiny lines like rays of light. When she asked where he had seen it, he shrugged and said, "It's the mark from the humming." She didn't understand, but she kept the drawing. Years later, when she passed away peacefully in her sleep, that same symbol was found carved into the headboard of her bed. No one had seen Jorin do it, but no one was surprised. The humming had never left. It simply lived quietly now, inside moments, in the hush before rain, in the warmth between friends, in the way grief could sit beside joy without fighting. It didn't need to shake the sky anymore. It had found gentler ways to be heard. In the deep woods, a woman named Sarah kept a journal, not of events, but of silences. She would walk through the forest and write about the sounds that weren't there, the absence of footsteps, the gap between bird calls, the stillness before wind touched the leaves. People began reading her journals aloud in public squares, not for answers, but for calm. Her words became lullabies for grown-ups, and children memorized them like songs. She once wrote, "The quiet is not the space where nothing happens. It's where everything becomes gentle enough to grow." That line was carved into a stone beside the river. People began leaving flowers there, not because it was sacred, but because it reminded them to slow down. And across the sea, on the island that had once been hidden, the spire remained, weathered now, covered in ivy. Its door never opened again, not because it was locked, but because no one asked it to. Those who came simply sat nearby. They brought no offerings. They left no messages. They just listened. And the spire, it listened back. One evening, when the sky was gold and thick with stillness, a girl sang beside it. A tune without words, just sound. And the wind picked it up, carried it softly through the trees, across the water, into valleys, into dreams. No one remembered the melody the next day, but everyone woke feeling rested, as if something that had been holding tight had finally let go. And so the world moved on, not untouched, not unchanged, but softer, wiser, warmer. The sickness was still a part of its story, but not the end of it. And in the places where fear had once taken root, new things began to grow. Small things, simple things, but strong, just like the people who tended them. And so, the final traces of the sickness faded, not in a single moment, but gradually, like the last breath of winter giving way to spring. There was no grand celebration, no fireworks, no king's decree. Just morning light through clean windows, the sound of footsteps on earth instead of hurried wheels on stone, and the quiet rhythm of people remembering how to live again. The spire, once the center of fear and wonder, became part of the landscape. People still whispered about it, some saying it had once held the dreams of the entire world, others believing it was nothing more than a strange ruin that had found its peace. But no one tried to open it again. They didn't need to. Those who had dreamed the corridor, who had seen the figure cloaked in silence and light, found a sense of calm in their waking lives. The dreams no longer returned. And in their place came rest. Deep, undisturbed sleep. The kind that felt safe. The kind that reminded the body it had survived. Theo was never seen again, but those who had known him carried his story forward. Not as a myth, but as a memory. Children grew up hearing about the boy who listened to the humming and followed it into the unknown. His name became a quiet blessing. When someone was lost or frightened, others would say, "Walk like Theo." Gentle and brave. Villages rebuilt slowly. Fields were planted with care. People who had once turned away from their neighbors now shared what they had. Sickness had taught them how quickly everything could be taken. Recovery taught them how slowly it could be earned. There were no shortcuts, no magic cures, only patience, hands in soil, food shared without keeping count, and the daily practice of kindness. Doctors became listeners. Healers were no longer seen as miracle makers, but as companions in the long walk back to health. They didn't promise escape anymore. They offered presence. In the coastal towns, ships sailed again. But the trade was different now. Less gold, more goods. People exchanged herbs, stories, seeds. And sometimes, between one port and the next, a sailor would swear he saw a light on the horizon that moved like a heartbeat, then faded before anyone else noticed. These tales were told with a smile, not fear, because people understood now that not everything unexplained had to be dangerous. Some things simply were. Like the wind, like memory. Ira, once bound to her chair and the view from her window, began walking again. Slowly at first, then farther each day. Not because she had been healed in some miraculous way, but because she had begun to believe it was possible. The dreams had stirred something inside her. Not youth, not strength, but purpose. She didn't chase the past. She walked forward. Every morning, she placed a stone at the edge of her garden. By spring, there was a circle. People started adding to it, buttons, feathers, pressed flowers. It became a gathering place. No one declared it sacred. But when someone sat there in silence, others waited to speak until they were ready. The symbol that had appeared in dreams, a circle within a square, wrapped in gentle rays, began showing up on doors and fences, carved into wood or drawn in chalk. It wasn't tied to any religion or rule. It simply meant, you are welcome here. Travelers came to trust it. When they saw it, they knew there was food, a place to rest, someone who would ask nothing in return. Some people called it the gatekeeper's mark. Others just called it the light. The gate itself remained untouched. Whatever force had opened it, whatever message it had carried, had passed. But the memory stayed, not as fear, as awareness. People began teaching their children to feel for the hum in the earth. Not to fear it, but to listen. If the hum returned, they said, it would mean something needed to be remembered again. Until then, the world would rest and grow. Old songs returned. New ones were born. Laughter echoed in courtyards. Grief didn't vanish, but it became less lonely. When someone lost a loved one, the village gathered without being asked. They didn't say much. They just came. Sometimes they brought a candle. Sometimes they sat and said nothing. But no one grieved alone anymore, because the sickness had taught them that being alone was often the deepest wound of all. The birds returned in full. Not just one kind. Many. They filled the skies with color and song. People began noticing again how many shapes the clouds could take, how many sounds lived in a single forest morning. Things that had once been background noise became sacred again. And in that shift, life didn't become perfect, but it became fuller. Some of the older villagers, those who had lived through the first wave of the plague, said they never expected to see a world like this again. They thought fear had taken too strong a root. But now, sitting beneath open skies, they realized something simple and powerful. Healing had never been about forgetting the pain. It had always been about letting the pain teach them how to hold each other better. The dead were not erased from memory. They were remembered in how the living treated one another. Their names were spoken during meals. Their favorite songs played during harvest. Their faces were not framed on walls, but seen in the way people laughed and forgave. And this, more than anything, kept them near. The sickness, which once seemed like the end of everything, became the seed for something new. It had arrived as a shadow, but left as a mirror. It showed people what they were afraid to face, how disconnected they had become, how fragile, how beautiful. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. They began to live as if every moment mattered, because now they knew it did. And so the world did not return to what it was before. It became something softer, stronger, wiser. And in the still hours of the night, when the stars were high and the wind was calm, people could lie down in their beds, close their eyes, and fall into dreams that no longer carried warnings, but invitations. To rest, to trust, to begin again. And that, in the end, was the gift the sickness left behind. Not fear, but remembering. And from that remembering, peace. A peace quiet enough to sleep in, and strong enough to build a future on.